Those enslaved in Arkansas experienced bondage in a variety of different ways depending on whether they lived in rural or urban settings. In rural areas, enslaved people were more likely to work on plantations where they were subjected to long hours of hard labor and harsh living conditions. In urban areas, enslaved people were more likely to work in domestic services or skilled trades, while urban enslavement offered more of those who were enslaved opportunities for autonomy and social interaction. It also came with its own challenges, such as increased exposure to violence and abuse. A large portion of those enslaved in Arkansas lived and worked in rural areas especially on plantations. On these plantations, enslaved people were first forced to work in fields picking cotton, growing rice, and other crops. They were also often tasked with other chores such as cooking, cleaning, and caring for livestock. Life on a plantation was extremely difficult for enslaved people. Those living on a plantation were often malnourished and poorly clothed. They were also subjected to harsh punishments, even for the slightest infractions. Enslaved people were whipped, beaten, or even killed by their owners. Despite the hardships that those individuals faced, they developed their own communities and culture. They often held religious services and social gatherings in secret. They also began to sing songs that actually told the story and passed down their culture and history and heritage. A small number of enslaved people in Arkansas lived in urban areas. In these areas, enslaved people were more likely to work in domestic services or skilled trades. Some enslaved people worked as cooks, housekeepers, and nannies in the homes of wealthy white families, while others worked as carpenters, blacksmiths, or other skilled tradesmen. Urban enslavement offered some enslaved people more opportunities for autonomy and social interaction. Those enslaved people in urban areas were more likely to move around easier and interact with other people. In some cases, those interactions were actually with free individuals. Uh, they were also more likely to have access to education and religious services. However, urban enslavement also came with its own challenges. Those enslaved in the urban areas were highly exposed to violence and abuse. They were also likely to be sold away from their families. Some examples of how people experience bondage in a rural setting, in particular on the Barton Plantation in Phillips County. Enslaved people were forced to work at least 12 hours a day in the fields. They were also frequently whipped and beaten by their owners. On the Woodruff Plantation in Jefferson County, those enslaved women were forced to work in fields while pregnant, even immediately or soon after giving birth. They were also often separated from their children. In an urban setting, especially within the city of Little Rock, enslaved people worked in a variety of occupations, including domestic service, skilled trades, and construction. Some were able to build their own businesses and save up money to purchase their freedom. However, enslaved people in Little Rock were also exposed to horrific acts of violence, with one particular instance where several individuals were lynched by a group of white men for no apparent reason, or basically without just or cause. In conclusion, those enslaved in Arkansas experienced bondage in different ways depending on whether they lived in rural or urban settings. Enslaved people on plantations were more likely to be subjected to long hours of hard labor and harsh living conditions. Those enslaved in urban areas were more likely to work in domestic or skilled trades. and had more opportunities than those living in the rural settings. However, they were not without abuse or violent acts being committed to them or towards them. It is important to note that enslaved individuals within Arkansas, either in a rural or urban setting, resisted their enslavement in many ways. They fled plantations, sabotaged property, they fought back against their owners. They also built communities and cultures that helped them cope of the hardship of slavery.